Hello, my name is Raven, and today I want to read you guys The Body Keeps the Score. I have PTSD myself, specifically complex PTSD, and for me in particular, this book has been hard to read, so I thought I would force myself to on my YouTube channel because I think it is really, really important to educate people about PTSD so that you can be better people to the people around you in this world, because it is more common than you think, and it's very serious. Let's get into it. So this is called The Body Keeps the Score. Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. It's written by Bessel Kolk, who is an MD, so this is a reliable source. Okay, we're going to start with the prologue. Facing trauma. I am going to put multiple trigger warnings here. Trigger warning, multiple trigger warnings. If you want to click off and you cannot handle hearing any of this stuff, I definitely don't recommend hearing this if you're in any type of sensitive state. If you are sensitive to very intense traumatic things, then I recommend clicking off of this video. Subscribe to my channel, like this video, and come back another time, but this is not the one for you, my dear. But I'm also kind of desensitized because I've been through a lot in my life, which is why I have complex PTSD. A lot of this is not going to affect me as much as it's going to affect the regular person. So I, again, strongly advise against watching this if you are sensitive to traumatic things. Here we go. Prologue. Facing trauma. One does not have to be a combat soldier or visit a refugee camp in Syria or the Congo to encounter trauma. Trauma happens to us, our friends, our families, and our neighbors. Research by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has shown that 1 in 5 Americans was sexually molested as a child, 1 in 4 was beaten by a parent to the point of a mark being left on their body, and 1 in 3 couples... Okay. I'm really gonna have to put myself out of my mind for this. Hold on. Okay. And 1 in 3 couples engages in physical violence. A quarter of us grew up with alcoholic relatives, and 1 out of 8 witnessed their mother being beaten or hit. As human beings, we belong to an extremely resilient species. Since time immemorial, we have rebounded from our relentless wars, countless disasters, both natural and man-made, and the violence and betrayal in our own lives. But traumatic experiences do leave traces, whether on a large scale, on our histories and cultures, or close to home, on our families, with dark secrets being imperceptibly passed down through generations. They also leave traces on our minds and emotions, on our capacity for joy and intimacy, and even on our biology and immune systems. I know this all too well. I will give my insight here and there, but before we get further into this, I do want to say I have dealt with severe PTSD for a majority of my life, and only at the end of last year of 2022 did I find the right treatment for me. It's more of a natural method, ketamine treatment therapy, and for the first time in my life I feel like a person on earth, and it's really nice, but I feel like it is a point in my life to educate people about this condition because it's been debilitating for me. And I've been bullied for it, I've been harassed for it, I've been told that people don't believe me, I've been told that I'm seeking attention. Everything under the sun that people have been told who have any type of illness, I've dealt with it. And I'm really glad to have found YouTube and learned that other people go through this with every illness under the sun. Jake Doolittle with Lyme disease, Jacob Sharp with his cancer, he literally had brain cancer, and people still deny those people of their illnesses. Like, being invalidated is something that can make or break somebody, and finally, instead of breaking me, it is making me the person that I am today. It's made me a better person because I know that I'm valid, and especially after learning about this condition so much and learning how it is supposed to be treated rather than how I was treated my whole life. I am going to have some very strong reactions to this. I apologize for that. As a PTSD survivor and just as a person in general, I'm very, very sensitive, and I cry very easily. I feel emotions very easily, but I'm going to try to keep my composure for you guys because this is very important. Okay, here we go. Trauma affects not only those who are directly exposed to it, but also those around them. Soldiers returning home from combat may frighten their families with their rages and emotional absence. The wives of men who suffer from PTSD tend to become depressed, and the children of depressed mothers are at risk of growing up insecure and anxious. Having been exposed to family violence as a child often makes it difficult to establish stable, trusting relationships as an adult. Trauma, by definition, is unbearable and intolerable. Most rape victims, combat soldiers, and children who have been molested become so upset when they think about what they experienced that they try to push it out of their minds, trying to act as if nothing happened and move on. It takes tremendous energy to keep functioning while carrying the memory of terror and the shame of utter weakness and vulnerability. While we all want to move beyond trauma, the part of our brain that is devoted to ensuring our survival, deep below our rational brain, is not very good at denial. Long after a traumatic experience is over, it may be reactivated at the slightest hint of danger and mobilize disturbed brain circuits and secrete massive amounts of stress hormones. This precipitates unpleasant emotions, intense physical sensations, and impulsive and aggressive actions. These post-traumatic reactions feel incomprehensible and overwhelming. Feeling out of control, survivors of trauma often begin to fear that they are damaged to the core and beyond redemption. That is something I can attest to. I'm not going to say anything further right now. The first time I remember being drawn to study medicine was at a summer camp when I was about 14 years old. My cousin Michael kept me up all night explaining the intricacies of how kidneys work, how they secrete the body's waste materials, and then reabsorb the chemicals that keep the system in balance. I was riveted by his account of the miraculous way the body functions. Later, during every stage of my medical training, whether I was studying surgery, cardiology, or pediatrics, it was obvious to me that the key to healing was understanding how the human organism works. When I began my psychiatry rotation, however, I was struck by the contrast between the incredible complexity of the mind and the ways that we human beings are connected and attached to one another, and how little psychiatrists knew about the origins of the problems they were treating. Would it be possible one day to know as much about brains, minds, and love as we do about the other systems that make up our organism? We are obviously still years from attaining that sort of detailed understanding, but the birth of 3 new branches of science has led to an explosion of knowledge about the effects of psychological trauma, abuse, and neglect. Those new disciplines are neuroscience, the study of how the brain supports mental processes, developmental psychopathology, the study of the impact of adverse experiences on the development of mind and brain, and interpersonal neurobiology, the study of how our behavior influences the emotions, biology, and mindsets of those around us. Research from these new disciplines have revealed that trauma produces actual physiological changes, including a recalibration of the brain's alarm system, an increase in stress hormone activity, and alterations in the system that filters relevant information from irrelevant. We now know that trauma compromises the brain area that communicates the physical, embodied feeling of being alive. These changes explain why it's just really crazy to me to read something that is so incredibly validating versus my entire life of being so invalidated when I have literally felt these things to my core and nobody has ever wanted to talk about it with me, which I understand it's pretty intense. But as somebody who goes through it myself, I'm able to talk about it candidly, and because it's helpful to talk about your mental health and going through it with other people. And when you're just only invalidated your whole life, it's really intense. So when I started learning about it and researching it and found books like this, I found this from Dr. Mike recommending it to me. So thank you, Dr. Mike. This book has meant so much to me learning about my PTSD and growing from it. But yeah. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invalidated, you are valid, okay? You are valid. And I hope that you realize that one day, because it took me a really long time to realize that about myself too. So don't feel alone in that. These changes explain why traumatized individuals become hypervigilant to threat at the expense of spontaneously engaging in their day-to-day lives. They also help us understand why traumatized people so often keep repeating the same problems and have such trouble learning from experience. We now know that their behaviors are not the result of moral failings or signs of lack of willpower or bad character. They are caused by actual changes in the brain. By the way, if you didn't know, PTSD is considered a mental disability. So if you've ever invalidated somebody for having PTSD, you can go screw yourself, okay? And you can never come back to my channel, for all I care. This vast increase in our knowledge about the basic processes that underlie trauma has also opened up new possibilities to palliate or even reverse the damage. which is what ketamine has started to do for me. It's something I never thought possible. We can now develop methods and experiences that utilize the brain's own natural neuroplasticity to help survivors feel fully alive in the present and move on with their lives. There are fundamentally 3 avenues. 1, top down by talking, reconnecting with others, and allowing ourselves to know and understand what is going on with us while processing the memories of trauma. 2, by taking medicines that shut down inappropriate alarm reactions, or by utilizing other technologies that change the way the brain organizes information. And 3, bottom up, by allowing the body to have experiences that deeply and viscerally contradict the helplessness, rage, or collapse that result from trauma. Which one of these is best for any particular survivor is an empirical question. Most people I have worked with require a combination. Very curious about what it means by bottom up, allowing the body to have experiences that deeply and viscerally contradict the helplessness, or collapse that result from trauma. So like instead of exposure therapy, it would be like love therapy. Something I'm definitely a believer in. Okay. This has been my life's work. In this effort, I have been supported by my colleagues and students at the Trauma Center, which I founded 30 years ago. Today, we have treated thousands of traumatized children and adults, victims of child abuse, natural disasters, wars, accidents, and human trafficking, people who have suffered assaults by intimates and strangers. We have a long tradition of discussing all our patients in great depth at weekly treatment team meetings and carefully tracking how well different forms of treatment work for particular individuals. Our principal mission has always been to take care of the children and adults who have come to us for treatment. But from the very beginning, we also have dedicated ourselves to conducting research to explore the effects of traumatic stress on different populations and to determine what treatments work for whom. We have been supported by research grants from the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, the Centers for Disease Control, and a number of private foundations to study the efficacy of many different forms of treatment, from medications to talking, yoga, EDMR, theater, and neurofeedback. Theater? You telling me I gotta be a theater kid? No, I was a theater kid. Can you tell? The challenge is how many people gain control over the residues of past trauma and return to being masters of their own ship. Very few, which is very sad, and why I will not shut up about this and will continue teaching the world about it, because I almost gave up on life many, many times, and I know people who did. Talking, understanding, and human connections help, and drugs can dampen hyperactive alarm systems. I'm not speaking for every survivor, but for me, prescription medications did not work. They made me worse. They made me feel like I was losing who I was as a person. But we will also see that the imprints from the past can be transformed by having physical experiences that directly contradict the helplessness, rage, and collapse that are part of trauma, and thereby regaining self-mastery. Again, what do they mean? This is interesting. I have no preferred treatment modality, as no single approach fits everybody, but I practice all the forms of treatment that I discuss in this book. Each one of them can produce profound changes, depending on the nature of the particular problem and the makeup of the individual person. I wrote this book to serve as both a guide and an invitation to dedicate ourselves to facing the reality of trauma, to explore how best to treat it, and to commit ourselves as a society to using every means we can to prevent it. If you know a child who is in a bad situation and you think that you can do something about it, do something about it. Say something about it. Call DFS. Call welfare, whatever it is in your country, your state, whatever. That's all I'm going to say on that. Okay, we're going to move on to part 1. The Rediscovery of Trauma. Chapter 1. Lessons from Vietnam Veterans. I think that I will read a little bit more for you guys. I'm going to make this at least a 30-minute video. But I just read the first couple of quotes that the chapter starts with, and they're quoting a couple of men who have been in war. And the first quote actually is from a book that I was made to read in, I think, 8th grade. They forced us to read The Kite Runner, which is horribly, I'm sorry, but in my opinion, inappropriate to make children read. I don't know, I guess it's super educational, but it was horrible for me to read as a PTSD survivor who didn't even know that's what was wrong with me. In 8th grade, going to school was my safe place, and they made me read the worst book in the entire world, in my mind. A couple of them. One of them being The Kite Runner, about a little boy. He was made to start being in war at the age of 12, and that book is written from his perspective, and is it a hard book to read, and I had to read it for school. In Wyoming, by the way, is where I grew up. Well, I guess it was good that they made us read that. It was educational, but still horrifying. Gosh. The quote that just made me tear up a bit was from Khaled Hosseini. I don't know how to say it. Khaled, the writer of The Kite Runner. I became what I am today at the age of 12 on a frigid, overcast day in the winter of 1975. That was a long time ago, but it's wrong what they say about the past. Looking back now, I realize I have been peeking into that deserted alley for the last 26 years. That is literally how I feel about my childhood, and about how every subsequent trauma that's happened to me. It genuinely feels like yesterday, if you look back on it enough, because your body remembers it as if it's yesterday. For some reason, your body thinks, oh, this will help you prevent it from happening again, or this will help you be more prepared for it if you are able to completely feel like you're there again in just a moment of memory. It's insane. It's scary. To feel like you're looking back at something for 26 years. That is the best way to describe PTSD. There's no control over that. You don't know that you're doing it. Your brain has done that, and you just have to live with it, and it sucks. The second quote is from Jessica Stern, from her book called Denial, A Memoir of Terror. I haven't read this yet. Some people's lives seem to flow in a narrative. Mine had many stops and starts. That's what trauma does. It interrupts the plot. It just happens and then life goes on. No one prepares you for it. And then the chapter starts. Lessons from Vietnam Veterans, Chapter 1. The Tuesday after the 4th of July weekend, 1978, was my first day as a staff psychiatrist at the Boston Veterans Administration Clinic. I'm remembering reading this chapter before, and it was really hard for me. I think this is where I had to stop. As I was hanging in a reproduction of my favorite Bruegel painting, The Blind Leading the Blind, on the wall of my new office, I heard a commotion in the reception area down the hall. A moment later, a large, disheveled man in a stained three-piece suit, carrying a copy of Soldier of Fortune magazine under his arm, burst through my door. He was so agitated and so clearly hungover that I wondered how I could possibly help this hulking man. I asked him to take a seat and tell me what I could do for him. I have not been to war. I never really knew any war veterans until very recently when I fell in love with one. I asked him to take a seat and tell me what I could do for him. His name was Tom. 10 years earlier, he had been in the Marines, doing his service in Vietnam. He had spent the holiday weekend holed up in his downtown Boston law office, drinking and looking at his old photographs, rather than with his family. He knew from previous years' experience that the noise, the fireworks, the heat, and the picnic in his sister's backyard, against the backdrop of dense early summer foliage, all of which reminded him of Vietnam, would drive him crazy. When he got upset, he was afraid to be around his family because he behaved like a monster with his wife and 2 young boys. The noise of his kids made him so agitated that he would storm out of the house to keep himself from hurting them. Personally, as a very, very noise-sensitive person, I've experienced this. I went to hang out with a friend for the first time, and she had 2 young kids. One of them yelled in my face for about 10 minutes straight, and I completely dissociated, and I don't react with rage. I react more so by shutting down and, needing to run away. And I just remember, not being able to even comprehend what the kid was saying anymore, and needing to go to another room and get my head back together, because there was too much going on all at once. It's overstimulation. Your brain gets overwhelmed easily, especially in a weakened state, which I was in. This makes sense that he's saying that, especially on the 4th of July with all the sound. It's harder to be around people and be communicative with people when you're already being triggered by all of the sounds that you can't control around you. Only drinking himself into oblivion or riding his Harley-Davidson at dangerously high speeds helped him to calm down. Nighttime offered no relief. His sleep was constantly interrupted by the nightmares about an ambush in a rice paddy back in Nam, in which all the members of his platoon were killed or wounded. He also had terrifying flashbacks in which he saw dead Vietnamese children. The nightmares were so horrible that he dreaded falling asleep, as he often stayed up for most of the night, drinking. In the morning, his wife would find him passed out on the living room couch, and she and the boys had to tiptoe around him while she made them breakfast before taking them to school. Filling me in on his background, Tom said that he had graduated from high school in 1965, the valedictorian of his class. In line with his family tradition of military service, he enlisted in the Marine Corps immediately after graduation. His father had served in World War II in General Patton's army, and Tom never questioned his father's expectations. Athletic, intelligent, and an obvious leader, Tom felt powerful and effective after finishing basic training, a member of a team that was prepared for just about anything. In Vietnam, he quickly became a platoon leader, in charge of 8 other Marines. Surviving slogging through the mud while being strafed by machine gun fire can leave people feeling pretty good about themselves and their comrades. At the end of his tour and duty, Tom was honorably discharged, and all he wanted was to put Vietnam behind him. Outwardly, that's exactly what he did. He attended college on the GI Bill, graduated from law school, married his high school sweetheart, and had 2 sons. Tom was upset by how difficult it was to feel any real affection for his wife, even though her letters had kept him alive in the madness of the jungle. Tom went through the motions of living a normal life, hoping that by faking it he would learn to become his old self again. He now had a thriving law practice and a picture-perfect family, but he sensed he wasn't normal. He felt dead inside. Although Tom was the first veteran I had ever encountered on a professional basis, many aspects of his story were familiar to me. I grew up in post-war Holland, playing in bombed-out buildings, the son of a man who had been such an outspoken opponent of the Nazis that he had been sent to an internment camp. My father never talked about his war experiences, but he was given to outbursts of explosive rage that stunned me as a little boy. How could the man I heard quietly going down the stairs every morning to pray and read the Bible, whilst the rest of the family slept, have such a terrifying temper? How could someone whose life was devoted to the pursuit of social justice be so filled with anger? I witnessed the same puzzling behavior in my uncle, who had been captured by the Japanese in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, and sent as a slave laborer to Burma, where he worked on the famous bridge over the River Kwai. The River Kwai, Kwai. He also rarely mentioned the war, and he too often erupted into uncontrollable rages. As I listened to Tom, I wondered if my uncle and my father had had nightmares and flashbacks, if they too had felt disconnected from their loved ones and unable to feel any real pleasure in their lives. Once you start learning about PTSD, you guys, it's pretty easy to spot it in people in your lives. When people aren't willing to talk about stuff, when people have mental breakdowns or rage randomly, and they don't ever want to talk about it, and they act like everything's normal after that, that's probably a severe PTSD survivor who hasn't even confronted to themselves that there is something wrong and that they need to get help. So I know that because I was in that stage of my life for a very long time, and now when I see it in people, it's very easy to spot. They often are bullies if they've gone down the route of not taking care of themselves and not admitting to themselves. Often people who are PTSD survivors can become very extreme bullies, and it's like their coping mechanism is making other people feel pain so that they can distract from their pain. It's really interesting, but it's really sad and hard to see. Somewhere in the back of my mind, there must also have been my memories of my frightened and often frightening mother, whose own childhood trauma was sometimes alluded to and, I now believe, was frequently reenacted. Basically, probably why my childhood was so bad is because my mother herself had a bad childhood. It goes down generations if nothing is done about it. She had the unnerving habit of fainting when I asked her what her life was like as a little girl, and then blaming me for making her upset. Reassured by my obvious interest, Tom settled down to tell me just how scared and confused he was. He was afraid that he was becoming just like his father, who was always angry and rarely talked with his children, except to compare them unfavorably with his comrades who had lost their lives around Christmas 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. As the session was drawing to a close, I did what doctors typically do. I focused on the one part of Tom's story that I thought I understood, his nightmares. As a medical student, I had worked in a sleep laboratory, observing people's sleep dream cycles, and had assisted in writing some articles about nightmares. I had also participated in some early research on the beneficial effects of the psychoactive drugs that were just coming into use in the 1970s. Really quick, I want to mention I had nightmares for years upon years of my life, and then after leaving my traumatic household that I grew up in and living alone as an adult, I had severe, intense, what are they called? Repeated nightmares? Why can't I ever think of words when I need to? You guys know what I'm talking about, right? Where you have the same dreams over and over again, or they're based in the same spots. I used to have those constantly about my past, about my family members bullying me, and then very recently, like in the last 2 years of my life, those have subsided. And I've noticed if I go around my family, specifically the family member who bullies me the most and like ruined my self-image as a child, if I go around her and she bullies me more and says things that get in my head again, or she tries to, I have nightmares again. The last time I saw her was 2 years ago, and after that I had nightmares about her coming to my house unannounced and banging on the door, and basically I felt like I was going to die because that's how scary this person is to me. She's done that purposefully, mentally abusing me and verbally and emotionally abusing me to the point where I'm terrified of her, and she's known that she can continue to do that to me as an adult, which is scary as hell. So I've had to cut that person completely out of my life. And since then, I've been doing the best I've ever been. So sometimes you literally have to cut blood out of your life. I don't count that person as family because they've never treated me like family. They didn't care about me or my feelings or my mental health. For all they cared, I could have been dead because they knew how badly I struggled mentally. And they still continued. So, while I lacked a true grasp of the scope of Tom's problems, the nightmares were something I could relate to, and as an enthusiastic believer in better living through chemistry, I prescribed a drug that we had found to be effective in reducing the incidence and severity of nightmares. I scheduled Tom for a follow-up visit 2 weeks later. When he returned for his appointment, I eagerly asked Tom how the medicines had worked. He told me he hadn't taken any of the pills. So that's another thing about this condition, is that you can literally be given something to help you and you don't do it because you're terrified of what it might do. If it does help, what will that be like? My brain is this way all the time. I don't know anything different than that. So it scares you. It scares you to think about being in a different place because being this way is all you've ever known. That sounds crazy. I know that it sounds crazy. But I think what this guy is about to get into here is that often with war vets, they especially do not want to change how they are because they don't want to let go of those memories of their friends, which is so heartbreaking to think about. They would rather live every single day heartbroken and devastated and reliving those memories than to lose them because they remind them of the men that died for them. It's so important to them to remember that no matter how badly it hurts them, they'll keep those memories. Trying to conceal my irritation, I asked him why. I realized that if I take the pills and the nightmares go away, he replied, I will have abandoned my friends and their deaths will have been in vain. I need to be a living memorial to my friends who died in Vietnam. I was stunned. Tom's loyalty to the dead was keeping him from living his own life, just as his father's devotion to his friends had kept him from living. Both father's and son's experiences on the battlefield had rendered the rest of their lives irrelevant. How had that happened, and what could we do about it? That morning I realized I would probably spend the rest of my professional life trying to unravel the mysteries of trauma. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, for doing that. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's thanked you for this book. How do horrific experiences cause people to become hopelessly stuck in the past? What happens in people's minds and brains that keep them frozen, trapped in a place they desperately wish to escape? I wrote a poem about this a couple years ago that is so beautifully devastating. I am so glad to have been able to write when I was in those stages, because it's become some of the most beautiful writing pieces I've ever created in my entire life, and it helps memorialize that feeling for other people to understand it better. It's literally this: it keeps you frozen, trapped in a place that you desperately wish to escape. Why did this man's war not come to an end in February 1969, when his parents embraced him at Boston's Logan International Airport after his long flight back from Da Nang? Tom's need to live out his life as a memorial to his comrades taught me that he was suffering from a condition much more complex than simply having bad memories or damaged brain chemistry or altered fear circuits in the brain. Before the ambush in the rice paddy, Tom had been a devoted and loyal friend, someone who enjoyed life, with many interests and pleasures. In one terrifying moment, trauma had transformed everything. During my time at the VA, I got to know many men who responded similarly. Faced with even minor frustrations, our veterans often flew instantly into extreme rages. The public areas of the clinic were pockmarked with the impacts of their fists on the drywall, and security was kept constantly busy protecting claims agents and receptionists from enraged veterans. Of course, their behavior scared us, but I also was intrigued. At home, my wife and I were coping with similar problems in our toddlers, who regularly threw temper tantrums when told to eat their spinach or to put on warm socks. Why was it, then, that I was utterly unconcerned about my kids' immature behavior, but deeply worried by what was going on with the vets? Aside from their size, of course, which gave them the potential to inflict much more harm than my 2-footers at home. The reason was that I felt perfectly confident that, with proper care, my kids would gradually learn to deal with frustrations and disappointments, but I was skeptical that I would be able to help my veterans reacquire the skills of self-control and self-regulation that they had lost in the war. Unfortunately, nothing in my psychiatric training had prepared me to deal with any of the challenges that Tom and his fellow veterans presented. I went down to the medical library to look for books on war neurosis, shell shock, battle fatigue, or any other term or diagnosis I could think of that might shed light on my patients. To my surprise, the library at the VA didn't have a single book about any of these conditions. 5 years after the last American soldier left Vietnam, the issue of wartime trauma was still not on anybody's agenda. Finally, in the Countway Library at Harvard Medical School, I discovered The Traumatic Neurosis of War, which had been published in 1941 by a psychiatrist named Abram Cardiner. It described Cardiner's observations of World War I veterans and had been released in anticipation of the flood of shell-shocked soldiers expected to be casualties of World War II. Cardiner reported the same phenomena I was seeing. After the war, his patients were overtaken by a sense of futility. They became withdrawn and detached, even if they had functioned well before. What Cardiner called traumatic neurosis, today we call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Cardiner noted that sufferers from post-traumatic neurosis develop a chronic vigilance for and sensitivity to threat. His summation especially caught my eye. The nucleus of a neurosis is a physioneurosis. In other words, post-traumatic stress isn't all in one's head, which you should never say to anybody struggling with something, as some people supposed, but has a psychological basis. Cardiner understood even then that the symptoms have their origin in the entire body's response to the original trauma. Cardiner's description corroborated my own observations, which was reassuring, but it provided me with little guidance on how to help the veterans. The lack of literature on the topic was a handicap, but my great teacher, Alvin Semrad, had taught us to be skeptical about textbooks. We had only one real textbook, he said, our patients. We should trust only what we could learn from them and from our own experience. This sounds so simple, but even as Semrad pushed us to rely upon self-knowledge, he also warned us how difficult that process really is, since human beings are experts in wishful thinking and obscuring the truth. I remember him saying, "The greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves." Working at the VA, I soon discovered how excruciating it can be to face reality. This was true both for my patients and for myself. We don't really want to know what soldiers go through in combat. We do not really want to know how many children are being molested and abused in our own society, or how many couples, almost a third, as it turns out, engage in violence at some point during their relationship. We want to think of families as safe havens in a heartless world, and of our own country as populated by enlightened, civilized people. We prefer to believe that cruelty occurs only in faraway places like Darfur or the Congo. It is hard enough for observers to bear witness to pain. Is it any wonder, then, that the traumatized individuals themselves cannot tolerate remembering it, and that they often resort to using drugs, alcohol, or self-mutilation to block out their unbearable knowledge? Tom and his fellow veterans became my first teachers in my quest to understand how lives are shattered by overwhelming experiences, and in figuring out how to enable them to feel fully alive again. Okay, that is only halfway through that first chapter of part 1, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you guys so much for sitting and listening to that with me. I know it's very intense. I very much appreciate you guys educating yourself about this, and if you're a PTSD survivor yourself, you are very, very brave, and I appreciate you continuing to try living with this condition because it's very hard. Know that you are loved, and you're a good person, no matter how badly you struggle. Thank you so much for watching. I know this was a heavy one. I'm gonna go smoke some marijuana. Try to relax from this. Hit that subscribe button if you made it this far, and give this video a like so that I know that you made it this far and that you liked this video. And make sure to hit that notification bell and hit all notifications if you would like to be notified when I come out with the next part in this, because I've only gotten through that much of the book. We got to page 12, ladies and gentlemen, so there's a lot more to go here. And I have a lot of other videos that I'm making as well. I've just made an Onlyfans video. I will link that below. It's about my journey starting Onlyfans. Definitely very interesting. I work really hard on my long-form content, so it would mean a lot for you guys to check my other videos out. Whatever you guys are doing, have a good day, good night, good evening. Bye, guys. I was gonna say I should take my glasses off, but then I wouldn't be able to read. I could read, but I would get a migraine like right away, because one of my eyes is nearsighted and one is farsighted, so that's not helpful at all. I just worry about how much glare there is, you guys. Okay, it's hard to start. Prologue, facing trauma. In Vietnam, he quickly became a... Oh. I remember him saying... I bit my tongue.